Hello, everyone. Welcome to this episode of the Debater's Perspective, where we sit down with intelligent debaters from across the world, discussing issues of global relevance and oftentimes issues that come up in your debating tournaments across any part of the world that you may be listening in from today. My name is Eze Nwakuba, and I'll be your anchor person for this episode. In case you are new here, this is a program brought to you by ARIE, a debate and public speaking company dedicated towards the proliferation of critical thinking skills for young people across the globe. And it is also a strong mandate of ours that we find a way to bridge the gap between the debating circuit that exists in the bubble and with mainstream society as well, which is again part of the reasons why we have the Debater's Perspective. Thank you very much for joining us today, and please do consider subscribing and liking this video if you do find it interesting and also worth your time. So for today's conversation, I have a very interesting guest and also an interesting show interesting program or topic to talk about today. But before we get into all of that, the preamble. With more than 13,000 estimated number of casualties, 1.5 million estimated number of internally displaced people, the conflict in eastern Ukraine has transitioned to a stalemate after it first erupted in early 2014. But shelling and skirmishes still regularly occur, including an escalation in the violence in the spring of 2021, which is what we're going to be talking about today. In more recent developments, in October 2021, Russia began moving troops and military equipment near the border with Ukraine, reigniting concerns over a potential invasion. Commercial satellite imagery and social media posts from November and December 2021 showed armor, missiles, and other heavy weaponry moving towards Ukraine with no official explanation. By December, more than 100,000 troops were in place near the border, and US intelligence officials warned that Russia may be planning an invasion of Ukraine in early 2022. In mid-December 2021, the Russian Foreign Ministry issued a set of demands which included a ban on Ukraine entering the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, and a reduction of NATO troops and military equipment in Eastern Europe in order for its military forces to be withdrawn. The United States and other NATO allies rejected these demands and have warned Russia of retaliation if Ukraine is invaded, including an economic sanction, and other assistance has also been deployed to Ukraine, including small arms and other defensive weaponry. This conflict in Ukraine risks further deterioration of US-Russia relations and greater escalation if Russia expands its presence in Ukraine or into NATO countries. Russia's actions have raised wider concerns about its intentions elsewhere in Eastern Europe, and a Russian incursion into a NATO country would solicit a response from the United States as a NATO ally. The conflict has heightened tensions in Russia's relations with both the United States and Europe, complicating the prospects for cooperation elsewhere, including on issues of terrorism, arms control, and the political solution in Syria and other regions of territorial disputes. To discuss this issue with me today is a WUDC Korea octo-finalist and EUDC Madrid ESL semi-finalist, breaking judge. He has also had judges break at other tournaments across the world, including Oxford, Yale, Princeton, Duxbridge Worlds, etc. He's also a Ukrainian national champion, finalist of the Ukrainian Nationals, winner of several competitions, including international ones, such as the Astana Open and the Lviv Open. Please join me as I make welcome ARIE MORA from Kyiv, Ukraine. Thank you very much, ARIE, for joining us. We're incredibly excited to have you on the program.
Thank you for the invitation. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, so let's get straight into it. Therefore, for the past few weeks, I think since 2022 kicked off, part of the issues that has been trending on the international scene has been, the conflict, although it still looks a lot more cold right now, but there's a lot of potentiality surrounding it. And, what exactly does the situation look like from someone who is on the ground? What does the political climate in Ukraine look like right now?
So before I go on to the specific issue, just a small caveat, considering the sensitivity of the issue, and also because I work for the NGO that is related to building accountability mechanisms and justice mechanisms in Ukraine. With regards to the armed conflict, I just want to say that those are my personal opinions, and I for sure cannot like speak for the majority or for everyone in Ukraine. Like especially for, like in general. But coming back to the question, I would say that the political climate and generally the mood is quite complex. I would say that the majority of Ukrainians in general, as the vibe is going, are trying to stay calm and not to panic too much, because and I think that this is basically what is the government position as being. They are trying to persuade both the domestic society, but also the international community that Ukraine is that there's like that there is no real ground for like all out like panic, and that you should stay calm, and that Ukraine is more capable than it was ever before to deal with such kind of aggression from Russia. I do think that people are still worried because of course you are kind of on the brink of much like larger escalation than it was for the last couple of years. But it is also important to remember that Ukrainians, even if they are like on different parts, living in different parts of Ukraine, are like used to some extent to the constant threat from Russia or like possibility of some kind of escalation. It definitely differs from region to region. So people in Eastern Ukraine like have definitely more grounds to be even more worried. But I'd say that overall this is something that is being considered throughout the time, and I would probably say that given the scale of the potential escalation, the attention to it, and the kind of the anxiety over it is probably more widespread, given that more of the territories can be affected more rapidly rather than it was before throughout the whole years of the war. But yeah, I'd say it's something between trying to stay calm and like trying to get of the understanding whether you should pack your things or something like that. Like throughout the media, there are already some messages in terms of, so in case there's escalation actually taking place, here's like what you need to do if you want to leave, here's what you need to do if you want to stay and like support the ground battles, here's what you need to pack in your backpack and stuff like that. So it's complex, but I wouldn't say everyone is like outright panicking and don't know what to do. Life is still ongoing, like events are still happening, plans are still being built, and it's important to understand in terms of the context of how the society is trying to live on under this kind of pressure.
Yeah. I do agree that from an external point of view, it always seems like it's much more than it is, because a few days ago, the Nigerian embassy released a public communique, asking its citizens to stay clear of certain areas, within Eastern Europe, and to also maintain constant communication with the embassies. And I think that, foreign diplomats are equally towing the same line. I think it's more or less about what could happen as opposed to what is already happening, that the fear is. But you do mention that, this is almost becoming a norm. What then can we say is that, because I think for every episode of it, there seems to be like a fresh, trigger. But what then can we say is like the reason why this conflict, happens initially? Like, what's the problem that Russia, for example, has with Ukraine?
Well, it's a tough question because for some reason it's always something different, but it's also the same thing. So I would say that it's important to remember that this is just a part of the ongoing conflict with several escalations throughout the past 8 years. And I think that to some extent, I would say that part of the interest is Russian desire. I would also make one caveat. I'm not speaking about Russia as like the whole Russian population. It's important to distinct like the incentives of the current power and regime and like the ordinary people who might be different in their views. But I would say that the Putin's regime is built to some extent on the idea of keeping closely and keeping an impact and like pressure and its control over the countries that were previously members of Soviet Union, given that before, like, despite the growing national identity in Ukraine, up until 2013, it was really strongly connected with Russia in general, culturally, societally, economically still. But anyway, it was a close connection between two countries. And Russia had maintained control over Ukraine in different ways. Not to say that Ukraine wasn't like an independent state, it was, and it is continuing to be, but Russia had like a strong control over it. I would say, so one of the reasons for it, and this is basically one of the reasons for why Maidan and the Revolution of Dignity started, was the more like the stronger dynamic for pro-Western development of Ukrainian like policy and Ukrainian like vector, right? So right in 2013, when the protest started, specifically because the then president Viktor Yanukovych actually refused, because of the influence from Russia, necessarily to back the economic agreement with the European Union. And I would say that this is one of the strong things that definitely keep Russia interested in Ukraine, besides the fact that it's just generally has like imperialistic ambitions in terms of like spreading out the control on different countries, but also coming specifically to this like current escalation. I think besides the point of the direct interest to Ukraine, because I think that there are multiple things that Russia might be interested over this potential escalation, such as, for example, like gaining a better control and access to Crimea, right, through like getting access through some other southern eastern territories of Ukraine, or getting an even higher like control over Ukraine in terms of economic and like political gains, like to get a better deal out of Minsk agreements and stuff like that. Besides that, I think that there is a specific interest, which was actually the focus of all the agreements that and all the negotiations that have been going on, which is the NATO-Russia NATO-Russia relationship, and how far they want for NATO to back down on their presence in Eastern Europe. And I think lastly, which is important to note here, is that I do think that the pretext for this is like the potential threat from NATO towards Russia, which I think is controversial in terms of how far it's actually realistic. But it also is important that in the notes and in the statements that Russia is making, it assumes the control over maintaining the how would we say, like the strong arm, not only on the Eastern Europe region, but also to some extent to the Central Asia regions, which indicates that Russia is interested in generally building up the perception of a strong player in the big region.
Okay, I'm going to, if it's okay by you, I'm going to then ask about because you mentioned a lot about NGOs and what their role is. If you want to talk about that, what are you then made to do right now? What is the role of the NGOs that are on the ground right now? What are they trying to do to ameliorate the situation?
So there are a couple of different types of NGOs operating, like both NGOs, but also international organizations who operate in Ukraine. I would say that part of it is humanitarian organizations, which are mainly operating to help and provide humanitarian aid to people on the ground in the affected territories, to help them either move and integrate into society, to help them provide some direct aid to the territories, to anti-mining operations and stuff like that. I think the other type of organizations that are operating is human rights organizations, those who are either monitoring the human rights violations on the affected territories throughout the conflict and reporting them, which is an important part of it, given that Ukrainian government is, while trying to do that as well, has limited capacities, and in that sense, in that sense, I would say that NGOs and generally this sector is a very important part of documenting and monitoring of the violations. The other part of it is like, while noting it, to provide campaigns and organizing campaigns for the protection of these rights, trying to mitigate the outcomes and the negative impact of those violations. But some of them are fighting the disinformation campaigns from Russia and trying to rebuild the narratives. For example, organization that I'm working in is mostly focused on helping the state and generally helping Ukraine to build the accountability mechanisms for the violations that have been committed throughout the conflict, and mostly the grave crimes that have been committed, because throughout the conflict there were a lot of war crimes, crimes against humanity that were committed. And I would say, given that this is a conflict and given that it has different elements to it, it is a very complex issue in terms of finding out who should be responsible, under which jurisdiction it should be responsible, what is the most feasible way to actually make the perpetrators accountable for the crimes that they committed. And I would say it is also a very sensible issue which NGOs are also like engaged with, is the understanding of how to reconciliate the society, because even though Russia is heavily involved and is mainly responsible for all the events that are ongoing, there is still like a dissent, there is still a difference, and there is still some disagreement within the society and the wounds that need to be healed. And going through this process is very tough and complicated. And then NGOs are making a big step in trying to build this kind of society that would be able to move on while the conflict isn't going, but also after it ends.
Okay, so there seems to have been a series of conflicts. Do you think that because this one seems to just have started, in late 2021, is this an isolated issue, or is there a relationship between this and, previous bouts of conflict?
So just to clarify, you mean like the series of the incursions and escalations throughout the Ukrainian conflict, right?
Yeah, I think it dates back to 2014, but I want to know now the fresh, conflict that's brewing. Is this a continuation of what we have been seeing since 2014, or is this just exclusively about NATO and all of that?
So I think that this is like is to some extent, I said before, I think it's both. I think that as you can probably notice throughout the last couple of years, like 2 or 3 years, there was a regular like amassing and buildup of Russian troops near the borders of Ukraine or in Belarus, which were happening under the pretext of some like internal operations and learnings that are happening there. I think that to some extent, this is definitely something that they were building up as a leverage and as a negotiation mechanism to show and to build up the likelihood of possible threat, which can be then used both with regards to furthering and leveraging the situation in Ukraine. So, for example, getting a better conditions for which would be more beneficial for Russia in terms of negotiating with the Eastern Ukraine conflict and the status of so-called LDPR. But also, I think that as of right now, it is mostly focused on NATO-Russia relationship, and this is something that is being the focus of the negotiations for the last couple of months, which is notably deferring the attention from actual problems and actual issues of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, which are what is happening in Crimea and Eastern Ukraine. And I think right now, like as of last couple of days, I think the regaining talks about the possibility to change the normative format or to continue working within it is something that can bring the talks closer to the original issue, but I still think it's gonna be both, because probably Russia is not so worried about like status of eastern regions of Ukraine as of right now, more than it's worried and interested in gaining a higher geopolitical control over it.
Asking, is it the dominance, right, or regional control that is under threat? Because I keep asking myself, if the problem is with NATO and their influence and Ukraine joining, how does that affect Russia, and why is Russia vehemently against that?
So if I understood the question correctly, I think that to some extent Russia wasn't really under like any like higher threat or than it was for the last couple of years. I don't think that there was a substantial difference in the actions that the West was actually like committing to in terms of Russian aggression towards Ukraine in general. I do think, that, however, that given the recent actions and the recent development of the international relations within this region, Russia might like accrue more problems and more tension from the West rather than it was under before, specifically because I think that the likelihood and the possibility to leverage this kind of threat is to some extent limited, while you still have to get into the talks about the regime, like the control regime over the temporarily uncontrolled territories in the east of Ukraine. You still would need to talk to some extent about the violations that Russia is committing and the aggression that it's like a generally hostile activity it's been doing for the last couple of months specifically, but also years in general. So I'm not sure if the threat towards Russia from the West is something that is really gaining up for the last couple of years. And it seemed to me, as far at least it's my personal opinion, that before that, like half a year ago, there was a lot of talks about NATO shifting its vector and focus in its activity more towards, for example, dealing with China or other rising challenges, changing the behavior and going more in preventing the conflict and cyber warfare and stuff like that, which I think is much more harder for them now to do, because they now still need to focus on Russia much more, specifically because of the occasions that Russia gives to the West to react to. So not sure how it's going to play out, but I do think that Russia is attracting attention to things that they might not want to get attracted to.
Okay, so what is the body language of the Ukrainian state right now, like as a government, not just the people? What is it? Because I think a lot of things, have to be predicated upon the decisions that Ukraine makes as a state now. So what would you say they are tending towards, like in terms of how can we predict their reaction?
So from the Ukrainian government, right?
Yes.
So I would say that as Ukrainian and generally as Ukrainian society, we would probably expect a bit more of communication in terms of what the Ukrainian government is actually planning and attempting to do, because they were kind of silent throughout all of these things. I think to some extent it is justified, specifically because unfortunately Ukraine is left out of a lot of talks that are happening right now. They are gonna be included a bit more as leaders of the Western countries are speaking about it now. However, unfortunately, Ukraine is not as much of a subject for talking, for the last couple of weeks at least. And this is, and I think that part of the reason for why Ukrainian government is reluctant to speak too much is because, given that they are not the strong hand in in all the situation, they are reluctant to provoke the possible reactions from Russia, for example. And I think that this is important, given that Russia is building its propaganda and building the pretext for possible invasion upon the possible violations and upon the possible tension created by Ukraine in some particular parts, regions, or the government itself. So I think part of this strategy is justified due to the fact that you don't want to talk too much to cause any more problems. But besides that, I still think that for lately, for the last couple of weeks, both President of Ukraine, but also the Ministry of Defense, the Minister of Defense were quite vocal and also condemning the West for being too panicking and for not getting the realistic approach to the situation, saying that Ukraine is capable to defend itself, saying that they can maintain maintain the situation to some extent. I'm not sure how far it's true given all of the stats, but this was the main narrative within Ukrainian government, which is look, it's not that bad. We are much stronger than we were before. Let's talk through this. Yes, it's possible that the invasion and the full-out invasion might happen, but we're still not there, and this might not happen. So let's work it out in one way or another. I guess something like that, but unfortunately we didn't get too much of the information besides except for what we had for the last couple of weeks.
So can we then say that the help, quote unquote, being offered by US is largely unsolicited?
Oh, no. I do think it's fairly welcome here, and this was also this was also the statement that was made by the Minister of Defense. He was basically Alexei Reznikov, who was previously the Minister of Reintegration of, as they call it, as temporarily uncontrolled territories of the east of Ukraine. So what he was saying is basically, we're getting a lot of help. We're getting stronger with it. It will be harder for Russia to do anything given all of this. So I don't think what they are trying to say is don't help us, but I definitely agree that this is the logical conclusion that one might derive from this kind of statements. And this is what some Ukrainians were kind of worried about and posting on their social media, saying, look, we are actually really, really grateful for all of the support. Please continue doing so. It's not like we can defend ourselves absolutely without any kind of help. The other issue here, I guess, is important to state two things about the foreign help that we are getting. First, I think it is really hard to say that any kind of help that is being sent right now would be sufficient enough to stop or prevent the invasion if it happens, because it's still a very marginal step-by-step development with a lot of barriers, such as prevention within NATO of countries to actually send troops or military equipment to Ukraine. I do think, though, that it can develop and the amount of it can rise as of last couple of days, such as US was committed to send more troops somewhere near closer to Ukraine borders and stuff like that. But I do think that even though it might not be sufficient to stop an all-out war, I do think that it is still very important in terms of building up the stakes for Russia to actually invade. I do think that as more weapons, more military equipment and personnel coming into Ukraine from Western countries, it becomes harder and harder for Russia to actually invade, because any of the casualties that Western countries would actually suffer and incur from this conflict would probably create a much more of a response from the West, rather than just some kind of a concern that they might or sanctions that they are stating right now. So I do think that even though it might not be sufficient for the all-out conflict, it still gets has the impact for prevention of the conflict to actually get to the full-on escalation.
I think that's a lot insightful, because it often then seems like this is more or less the bigger interest is that of the US and the West, versus Russia, and it's just like these are two external fights then happening on Ukraine in itself. Because I do think that if this is about Ukraine, then I don't think there would be all the issues about tensions rising. But I think that as US takes more and more actions, then Russia keeps getting more and more pressured to want to take some sort of action. Thank you very much, ARIE, for joining us. I've been getting signals about our timing, but I'm not going to let you go until we do. Usually, like it's a ritual here, we talk about like potential motions and how debaters could engage this in a tournament. So while you are thinking about that, if you just come in here for the first time, this is Debater's Perspective, brought to you by Royal Rhetorics. My name is Eze, and I've been talking with ARIE MORA from Kiev, Ukraine, and we've been talking about the Ukrainian conflict and all the many shades of it. Thank you very much for joining us. Please do ensure to subscribe, like, and share this video. Also leave us a comment if you do have any sort of reaction for us that you think might help improve our programs and our episodes as well. And of course, do make sure that you come around from time to time, because we'll also be having, much more exciting episodes for you. Okay, back to you, ARIE. So you're of course, you're a very, very experienced judge up to WUDC and EUDC level. So I'm going to, for 1 second, make you a chief adjudicator right now, but I wanted to set a motion on this issue. What would that be?
So to be completely honest, I don't have a specific motion to set, and I think that it is due to the fact that a lot of the issues that are going on like right now and currently are really hard to grasp in terms of what's going to happen like next, and or are really one-dimensional to some extent, and it's a bit hard to balance it out. I would say though that probably, given the uncertainty in the balance of internal and external interest in like the Western countries, different Western countries, I would probably suggest thinking into how should the West react, and whether, like, for example, US specifically, whether they should, for example, provide an active support and like get a very active in terms of providing military support to Ukraine, because I think it has some issues in terms of what would the administration and the society in general would want to do in terms of conflict with Russia, but also other conflicts, considering the fact that Joe Biden was mostly focused on China and tackling China in his activity throughout his term, at least for the last year. I would probably also say that to some extent you can also talk about the Russia point of view and perspective, and how far it would be actually beneficial for specifically Putin to continue and push through this. However, it's really hard to, at this particular point of time, it's really hard to take this kind of perspective, given that to some extent it just becomes unclear how far it is a pragmatic choice rather than something dictated by the intention that is missing out some of the calculations. But yeah, I would probably suggest looking into some of this stuff. The last thing that I would probably say, but it's probably more knowledge specific, is about what are the accountability and reconciliation mechanisms in Ukraine can be taken, and how should the society be integrated. However, I wouldn't probably be able to suggest a specific motion of this one, though the context is very interesting. I would suggest looking into it. Sorry.
Yeah, I do agree. I think I was at some American tournament in January, and I think they set the motion along what you discussed. This house supports the US increasing, its military aid to Ukraine. This looked like, I think they put in bracket things like having boots on ground, having more military intelligence and equipment, and all of those sort of things. Yeah, thank you very much so much, ARIE, for your time. I do sincerely appreciate. I do also understand that this issue is one that is particularly sensitive for you, who is actively working towards providing help and for people who are being displaced. And I do hope that we can, as soon as possible, find some sort of sustainable solution, just to ensure that there's some sort of stability within the region. But thank you very much for finding time to talk to us about this. I do appreciate it.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. Thank you for having me here.
All right. Bye.
Bye.